Welcome to the ACT podcast. Today you'll hear a snippet of my conversation with Graham Nichols from Affinity and former Christian MP Miriam Cates.
Yes, I was born in Sheffield, in the heart of South Yorkshire. My parents actually moved there, I think, 2 or 3 weeks before I was born. So they're from all over the place, but they'd been living in London, so they were new to Sheffield. Grew up there, went to a local comprehensive school, did well at school, went to Cambridge, did genetics, trained to be a teacher. Came back to Sheffield to do that. I got married, had 3 kids, took a career break. And then started getting involved in community life, really, in our village just to the north of Sheffield, the PTA, parish council, things like that. And then when our youngest child, who's now 10, was in the year before school, so his preschool year, I started to think about what I should do next. And I started looking into politics, considering standing for a local election. And to cut a long story short, a family friend asked me to stand as a Conservative for an unwinnable city council seat. I felt it was the right thing to do. I did it, got more involved in politics and became an MP. So that's the kind of potted history. But I had a fantastic, happy childhood. My parents are Christians, long history of faith in my family. My grandparents were missionaries. So very, very blessed with my heritage, really.
One of your kind of most notable achievements about the work that you did when you were in Parliament was drawing attention to ideological materials, relationships and sex education materials in schools, which is a matter close to many Christian teachers' hearts. I wonder, could you just explain a little bit? You've got a background in teaching. What was your experience like in education? And then what led you to pursue the course of action that you did when you called for this inquiry into these relationships and sex education materials?
Well, when I was in teaching, I think I took a career break in 2012 and then 2012, 2013, and haven't taught again since. So the educational landscape has changed a lot since then. And some of the aspects of political correctness, if you like, had started to come into schools back then, but nowhere near compared to the changes that we've seen since then. Of course, that coincides with the rise of social media, and a lot of ideas are spread very quickly because of that. But when I do remember before I was elected, coming to hear anecdotally about instances amongst people we knew of children who had decided to change gender and been told at school that that was the right thing to do, or counselled by the school counsellor, and seeing the damage that that had done to some families. But I assumed that this was highly unusual. Sheffield, as I said, is a very radically left-wing place. I assumed this was just kind of unique to Sheffield. But when I became an MP and I started working on education issues, people started writing to me from all over the country about what was happening to their children. And I became involved with a number of different support groups of parents who have the most heartbreaking stories of what's happened to their children. And often it started with a teacher or somebody coming into school and celebrating the fact that, as they said it, that some people are born in the wrong bodies and that you can choose to be a different gender. And then the next step, anybody who refuses to acknowledge that you're a different gender is then a bigot. And even meeting some parents who've been arrested or referred to social services for refusing to affirm their child in their new gender. And obviously this is a huge safeguarding disaster for so many reasons. Any attempt to separate a child from their parents, any attempt to talk to a child about sexual matters, these are all safeguarding red flags, but also fundamentally undermining truth to children is a really serious issue. And telling a child that there are more than two sexes, when from a biological point of view, that's absolutely ridiculous. This idea that somebody has an innate gender identity, that is made up. How do I know what it feels like to be a woman? Because I don't know what it feels like to you to be a woman. I just know what it feels like to be me. And getting confused between biological sex and natural personality variations. And I think as a Christian, Jesus reserves his most serious judgment on people who leave lead children astray. And he said that it's better to have a millstone tied around your neck, be thrown into the sea, than to lead one of these little ones astray. And the idea that our entire establishment, well, not our entire establishment, but elements of our institutions are collaborating in this leading of children astray, leading to children being mutilated and made infertile for life, leading to the breakdown of families and all sorts of abuse. It's just so morally wrong that I think all of us have got, as Christians and as adults, have a duty to stand up against it, whatever the social cost. And most people don't believe that there are 72 genders, but we've had this Emperor's New Clothes phenomenon, which is just a true tale of human nature, that it's very difficult to go against the crowd if there's a social cost to it. And of course, that's what there is. And you'll know this from education, Lizzie, particularly people working in schools and universities. The social cost of challenging this ideology is huge. And that's why so many people haven't done it. But I had a very privileged position in Parliament where MPs have this protection called parliamentary privilege, where you can say anything you want in the chamber of the House of Commons and nobody can sue you. And only 650 people at one time have that privilege. So I felt very strongly that it was my responsibility to use that on behalf of people who can't speak up for all sorts of reasons without losing their job or their livelihood or being sued. So, I tried to use that platform to represent the parents and the children that had spoken to me. And I think, what's been really interesting about that debate is moved on so much in just 3 or 4 years. And what's been so key is people from the left, feminists from the left, like J.K. Rowling, being brave. And it's much harder for people on the left to speak up about these issues. They face much more social cost than people on the right. But the collaboration of people on the left and more traditional conservatives like me, it's been incredible what we've seen in this country, in our mainstream media. There's still a lot left to be done, but we certainly have free speech on this issue now, which is a big change to just a few years ago.
Yeah,
absolutely.
Lizzie and I were in a briefing just recently, which was probably half Christians. So it was interesting that the rest of the group were people that I can't name, but anyway, people that were interested in the issue and campaigning on the issue who weren't Christians, or not Christians to my knowledge. So that was interesting. That was to do with conversion therapy ban or potential conversion therapy ban. And how best to approach it. I think though at a popular level it hasn't quite seeped through. And obviously we have views about sexual ethics as well and Christian marriage and so on. And I don't think if there is a sense of winning and losing, I don't think we're winning the battle on that front, in that's kind of landed as a kind of, well, that's that is totally acceptable and no one should ever critique that. Whereas I think with transgender there is more, it's up for debate. People realize it's incoherent, and I guess my prayer is that as that kind of explodes, it kind of might even feed back to the fact that they're all interconnected actually, because they're all to do with doing the wrong things with your body, basically, that it wasn't designed to do. So
yes, this idea that human beings are fungible, and that yes, you're right, they're all interconnected. And of course, in some ways, some of this started with more extreme forms of feminism, with women saying that there's no difference between men and women. Now, of course, men and women should be treated equally and have equal protections under the law, but they're not the same. And so the feminists who in the 1980s were saying that men and women are the same are now regretting that, because certain men have now said, fine, I'll be a woman. So yes, you're right. These are interconnected. But I think the really interesting thing about the trans debate is that it smacks you in the face in the way that the other ones don't, because that famous image of the American swimmer, I can't remember his name now, 6'4", standing next to two tiny little girls who he'd beaten in a race, or that Scottish rapist in a woman's prison. Those photos say more than 1,000 words. And even if you've never really thought about this very deeply, looking at those photos makes you realize that this is just wrong. Whereas those other debates is much, because our culture has been going down that route for so long, it's very difficult to think objectively about them. But I think this is why I do think that at the moment in our current culture, children should not be taught about sexual ethics in schools because there is no consensus. We are a multicultural society with people for all sorts of views of what constitutes a good and a bad sexual relationship, or what's, whether abortion is right or wrong, whether contraception is right or wrong. There is no consensus view. And therefore, anything a school teaches in this is by its nature political. It's not political to teach 2 + 2 is 4 because that is the consensus understanding. It is now political to teach anything about sexual ethics, whether that's Christian, not Christian, atheist. It is contentious. And so in a multicultural, multi-faith country, I don't think it's right anymore for schools representing the state to teach about sexual ethics, which essentially is what RSE is.
Yeah.
Would you say then that even that guidance didn't go far enough? Because I know there have been critical voices about that, suggesting that actually it just needs to be completely struck off curriculum altogether. Would you be in that camp then? Because many teachers really welcomed how kind of small c conservative this was, and the age restrictions. And at ACT, we were broadly happy with what the previous government delivered.
No, I think it was a good step forward, absolutely. And I don't think we're ever going to win these battles comprehensively or in one stage. So I think it was a real step forward, and it got people thinking about that some of these things were not appropriate for children's age and stage. Certainly drew a line in the sand about whether or not gender ideology was a respectable viewpoint. So yes, absolutely, they were a big step forward, and it's very disappointing that the new government has overridden those, although very predictable. I think with the gender questioning guidance, yes, that was an improvement, but I think the problem was that it didn't take the use of cross-sex pronouns seriously enough. Now, I think some people thought that the pronouns was the icing on the cake. So, okay, as long as you don't let children actually change sex or actually have medication, or you actively hide it from parents, it doesn't really matter whether you call them he or she, and you might as well do what they ask. Well, I would actually see it the other way around, because language is the great enabler of everything else. And if you call a boy she, then you are proliferating this lie that you can then change sex, and that's very dangerous in front of children. Again, it's the emperor's new clothes thing. Everybody knows it's a boy, so why are you saying her? And then that decreases the child's authority in the adult, and then you erode collective adult authority, which is again a really, really bad thing for children. So I actually think that the language is the key to this, and then everything else flows from it. But nevertheless, it was an important step forward. And again, it's very disappointing that the current Labour government have jettisoned it.
Did you, Miriam, get any abuse ever for your views, or people nasty to you in person or on social media, or
not so much on in person, well, with the odd exception, but yes, definitely on social media and in the mainstream media. I mean, the Guardian, well, I quite like when the Guardian up now, actually, but the Guardian aren't very nice about me. I think what you completely expect a fight over these issues. They're so contentious. There are people who are very invested in it on both sides, and it was quite many times viewed clip of the former Labour MP Lloyd Russell Moyle shouting at me in the House of Commons. And that made great drama, and actually it was very helpful because it perfectly illustrated the problem of men not letting women speak about their experience of single-sex spaces. So it was very helpful. But I think what surprised me more is on other issues where the attack has really come. So particularly the issue of whether or not mothers should be able to choose to look after their own children in the first 2 or 3 years of life. And that has actually proved to be the most controversial, bizarrely, debate that I have been involved in. And what was interesting about that is that the attack came from the right as much as the left. So I think if you're a conservative politician, you expect the likes of The Guardian and Observer to not like you very much. But when publications like The Times are so critical of what is basic conservative thinking, which is mother and baby have a very strong bond, it's a good idea not to break that.
Yeah.
That I did find that very surprising, actually.
So you wouldn't be super in favor of preschool, well, from sort of 0 to 2 funding?
No, I'm not. And I was absolutely opposed and devastated, actually, when the last government introduced funding for 9-month-olds to be separated from their mothers for 30 hours a day. Now,
Right.
there is a separate issue of can families survive on one income, which the answer to that is no, not anymore. And that is a massive and detrimental change. But the problem is that families can't survive on one income, not that little children should be in nursery care from a very young age. And I think we just have to look at the science in this and our own common sense, which is that a 9-month-old is not the same as a 3-year-old. And there is plenty of evidence that actually good preschool for 3-year-olds for 15 to 30 hours a week can be beneficial. Absolutely is beneficial, helps them to prepare for school as long as it's good quality, they have good relationships, everything like that. It's good. But 9 months old are not the same as 3 years old. And all the evidence we have suggests that high levels of institutional care for under 2s is detrimental. And that's what the evidence, and it's obvious really, because for the first year or two of a child's life, its mother is, or its primary carer is everything, and being separated from the primary carer can be a grief. And you can read experts like Erica Commissar on this. There's a lot of evidence now for attachment theory, and of course it's what most women don't actually want to be separated from their infants for long periods of time. It's the preference of most women to spend more time at home with their children when their children are young. Now, that doesn't mean women never ever want to go back to work. Actually, they do, absolutely. But it's just those first 2 or 3 years that are so important. And I do wonder, and certainly this is a theory that somebody like Erica Commissar would put forward, if the huge rise we've seen in things like ADHD and behavioural problems aren't at least in part a result of putting children in institutional care before they're ready and separating them from their mother, and then having them in a context where they're competing with other children for adult attention. I just, I think fundamentally as a conservative and as a scientist, it's a bad idea. But we're so wedded to our economic model of more GDP, more GDP, or more GDP, that actually the child's interest and even the mother's interest now comes secondary to whether or not there's an extra body in the workplace.
You've had a lot of experience looking into the state of education in the UK, your time on the Education Select Committee, your work revealing the RSE debacle. What are your hopes and prayers for the future of education in our country? We're going to be or the government is doing a massive curriculum dissection. And what do you hope and pray will come out of that? What are your fears, but also what are your hopes?
Well, I'm not very optimistic about the government's curriculum review, because I was just reading the paper this morning. Clearly, there's a political motivation to move away from knowledge into what people would call well-being, which I think is a big mistake. The whole point of education is to teach knowledge. It's up to children what they then do with it. But, again, teaching something like well-being is just... There is no, what is well-being? Nobody's an expert in well-being. There is no knowledge base in well-being, and therefore, what are you actually teaching children and why? So I'm not
Trojan
optimistic.
horse. Is that what you're thinking? Are you thinking it could be a bit of a Trojan horse?
Well, absolutely, but it's also a dumbing down, and I do think that we certainly shouldn't have an education system that values the academic above all else. Absolutely not. But we should be teaching children actual knowledge that they can then use later in life, rather than concepts, political ideas, well-being that is just a fad, and we will look back on in 50 years' time and think that it was a waste of time. So what I would really love to see in education is more diversification into the practical, technical, and vocational from the age of 14, because it struck me as a teacher and now as a mother that it's very clear by the age of 13 or 14, on the cusp of adulthood, that it's very clear where children's talents and interests lie. And for some, that will be academic, that they are our future researchers, lecturers, teachers. But for some, it'd be very clear that their talents and their ambitions lie in learning vocational skills, in becoming a plumber, in becoming a bricklayer, becoming, a hairdresser, or learning to manage a business. And it seems to me insane that we expect particularly teenage boys to sit through another 4 years of formal education when they clearly don't want to do it and could actually be earning money and taking responsibility elsewhere. And I think one of the biggest problems we've got in education at the moment is that it only values the academic and the those paper qualifications, and that's what's leaving so many children behind, and it's causing big problems for our economy because we have a shortage of plumbers and welders and engineers, and far too many graduates in degrees that aren't actually worth anything and haven't taught any skills and have just given somebody debt and expectation that can't be met. So I'm really interested in what Andy Burnham's doing in Manchester with this Manchester Baccalaureate, where they do have this kind of diversification from the age of 14, which is what they do in a lot of European countries. And I think if we did something like that, teach a classical curriculum up to the age of 14, maths, science, English, history, a basic grounding in the kind of knowledge you need for life and to understand what our heritage is. But then allow much more choice and to give equal status to the different routes after 14. I think it'd be transformative for boys, particularly who are biologically ready at the age of 14 or 15 to go out and learn how to be a man, rather than to sit in a classroom and be told, a few theories for the next few years. So I would think that would transform our education system for kids, especially poorer children.
Oh, it's really interesting. Do you know what? We could go on for quite a lot longer. We haven't even talked about social media and smartphones and all those kind of issues, which I know you also have views on, but we haven't got time for that. Last question then. Anything particular we could pray for you? Our listeners could pray if they think of you.
And also, how can we pray for Christians in Parliament, Christians, who are MPs?
I think, but pray for Christians in public life, generally, I think for protection, physical and spiritual, for collaboration. So it's an amazing thing to work with other Christians. I really loved that aspect of Parliament, people from all different spiritual backgrounds, Catholics, Protestants, evangelical, that is a really wonderful thing. So pray for better connections, especially between parties as well. There is some cross-party working, but it would be amazing if there was more. And then I think for courage, really, because it can be hard to speak up on some of these issues. And there are some amazing organizations out there that resource Christians in Parliament, like the Christian Institute, for example. There are those resources, but I suppose, courage to speak up and wisdom to know when and what to say, and then practical encouragement. I mean, it's really, really helpful when you get cards and emails from Christians saying, "I'm praying for you, thanks for standing up." It sounds like a small thing, but actually it's really meaningful. So I know, I'm terrible I always think, I should send a card to this person, and I never get around to it. I'm terrible at doing this, but it is so meaningful when people do it. So if you know a Christian politician, or you just write to them in Parliament, it does make a really big difference. And then for me personally, just, I suppose, just the usual, that God would show me what he wants me to do next, and that I would be faithful to that.
And for your family.
And my family.
Yeah, brilliant.
Thank you, Miriam. It's been an absolute pleasure to have you here with us. Thank you.
No worries. Lovely to speak to you. Thanks.